New Orleans, 1918. A man knelt at a back door unseen, working a chisel into a panel. He didn't knock, didn't break a window. He waited for the wood to come apart in his hands. Days later, a letter arrives, postmarked "From Hell," with demands that held a whole city hostage. The letter? Sent to the city's biggest newspaper. And the man behind it didn't stop at just one house. 11 houses, every one having the same cut panel on the back door. Inside the houses, nothing taken. These just weren't simple burglaries. On the morning of May 23, 1918, a grocer named Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine are found murdered with their throats slashed from a razor. The back door had a hole on the lower panel near the lock. On the stone outside their front door, 4 words in chalk. A name, Mrs. Joseph Maggio. It means nothing to the people reading it. A month later, another grocer is found murdered, then another. Each time the same panel on the door. The killer never brought a weapon, using whatever he found in the home, an axe or razor. By late summer, the city had a shape it didn't have before. One house, then several. All of them grocers, all of them Italian. By the end of the summer, nobody in the city slept the way they used to. Families take turns standing watch through the night. Every strange sound outside becomes a reason to light a lamp and check the locks again. And then, for 7 months, nothing happens at all, which somehow makes it worse. Months without an attack. Long enough for the city to believe it was over. The next house wasn't even in the city, it was across the river, in a town called Gretna. March 1919, in the same style of grocery store, a man, Charles, and his wife, Rosie Cortimiglia, and their 2-year-old daughter were sleeping. And what happened in their house before sunrise is the single most tragic part of this case. Their neighbor hears the screaming and doesn't wait for anyone else. He's already running before he knows what he's running toward. He finds Rosie on the floor holding her daughter, who is already gone. Charles is bleeding beside her, seriously injured by an axe. The neighbor doesn't stop to ask who did this. There isn't time. His son runs the other way, toward town, to bring back help. Neither of them stops to think about what this might cost them later. Days later, in her hospital bed, Rosie is asked who did this. She gives the police a name. It's the man who ran to save her. Within days, the father and son who ran across the street to help are arrested for the attack itself. Old business rivalry. Motive enough. The son is found guilty first. 17 years old, and the city sentences him to hang. His father is convicted next. Too old, the court decides, for the rope, so they give him the rest of his life instead. 2 men who ran toward a screaming house to save who was inside. A huge price to pay for just trying to save lives. Days later, a letter arrives at the city's newspaper, postmarked simply "From Hell." Whoever wrote it claimed to not be human, but a demon. He said he was actually responsible for the house in Gretna and for everything before it. He names a night, March 19. He names a time, 15 minutes after midnight. And he makes an offer nobody expects. Play jazz music in your home that night, he says, and you will be spared. You don't, you get the axe. The city has days to decide whether to believe a letter signed by a demon. Most decide they can't afford not to. On the night itself, the city does something nobody expects. It doesn't go quiet. It gets loud. Music pours out of windows up and down every street. Whatever happens that night, the city has decided to face it together, out loud, instead of alone in the dark. The morning came, and nothing had happened. No new house, no new name. For the first time, the night simply ends the way nights are supposed to. Whether the music worked or the threat was never real to begin with, the city will spend the rest of its life believing it knows the answer. Just as suddenly as it started, it's over. No arrest, no confession, no final house. It simply seems to have stopped. Years later, a name starts attaching itself to the story. The name people gave it was Joseph Mumfrey. Nobody could prove it belonged to the man who did any of this, but once a story needs a face, people will give it one. Some say he left this city for good. Some say he never stopped doing what he did, just somewhere no one was watching closely enough to notice. Either way, this is how the story has always ended. A house in Gretna, a letter from hell, 2 men still sitting in a cell for a crime the letter itself seemed to claim, and a city that never got to close the book. That is everything. What I just told you is a legend. It's been passed down, retold, and reshaped for over a century. Now, shall we take a deeper look at it? Together. First claim, no preamble. Every time he got in by chiseling out a single low panel on the back door. Let's actually test whether that's physically possible. Chiseling along the edges of one wood panel and prying it free with basic tools takes deliberate, sustained effort. A realistic estimate puts it somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes, depending on the wood and how quietly you're trying to work. And there's no way to do it without making noise the whole time. So the method is plausible. A determined person with a chisel really could open a door this way. The open questions are how long it would actually take under real conditions, and how noticeable that sound would be inside the house. Newspapers and police reports from the time describe the chiseled door panel in the Maggio attack, May 1918, and in several that followed. It's a repeated detail from the original accounts, not something added to the legend later. The coverage back then wasn't consistent though, with different papers working on deadline and no single file compiling it all. The method is physically possible, and it's documented across most of the major attacks. Now let's look at what he allegedly wrote. In the Maggio attack in May 1918, contemporary accounts describe a message written in chalk on the door. It read something like, "Mrs. Joseph Maggio will sit up tonight. Just write Mrs. Tony." Some of the old newspaper reports have it worded a little differently. "Will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony," but that kind of variation was common in 1918 reporting. Police back then treated the chalk message as a real clue, not anything supernatural. Over the years, the legend might have pushed it towards something more like prophecy, a killer who seemed to know things he shouldn't. The idea that it's the same man 6 years apart is the dramatic version the stories favor. But a single chalk reference that far apart doesn't prove one continuous killer. The message is real, and the reference is real. Whether it points to a years-long campaign remains a question. The letter is oddly literary for a death threat. It doesn't just say, "I'm going to kill you." It calls itself a demon from the hottest hell and name drops Tartarus, the lowest pit of the Greek underworld. That's deliberate, classical language, educated language. But the people who actually saw the attacker described a heavy-set man in dark clothes. Nothing about him suggested books or classical education. That mismatch between the polished voice on the page and the man at the crime scenes is hard to ignore. It raises a simple but important question. Are we even hearing from the killer? Up to the letter, every documented attack on the record targeted Italian immigrant grocer families in their homes. The letter suddenly broadens the threat to the entire city. That is a sharp change in victimology with no precedent in the attacks themselves. A mismatch like that doesn't automatically mean the killer couldn't have written it. People can be inconsistent in odd ways, but it's exactly the kind of detail that should make us slow down before we treat the demon letter as his real voice. Very shortly after the letter appeared in the paper, a New Orleans composer named Joseph John de Villa released sheet music called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz. The cover shows a terrified family playing instruments with an axe hanging over them. The timing is close enough to raise a real question. A song cashing in on the panic that quickly makes you wonder if the letter served the local music scene's interests as much as it served any killers. We don't have proof that de Villa wrote it himself, but the speed of the response is documented, and it gives us a solid reason to question whether that demon voice was really the killer's. So we have a real letter in a voice that doesn't match the witnesses, followed almost immediately by someone else making money off that same voice. We're not calling it solved, but the timing is worth looking at closely. The legend's biggest claim is that the city played jazz on command, and because of it, nobody died that night. The jazz night itself is well documented. It really happened, pulled together citywide in just a few days. The harder question is whether it actually stopped anything. Two things happening on the same night doesn't mean one caused the other. For that claim to hold up, we need some evidence that the killer was actually planning to strike that specific night, not just that the letter said he would. And the only source claiming an attack was coming that night is the letter itself, which we've already seen has some real problems. Without something more, the idea that the jazz night saved lives stays more legend than proven fact. Looking at the actual timeline of the attacks, there's no clear pattern of strikes on any kind of fixed schedule that the jazz night would have interrupted. The gaps between attacks, both before and after March 1919, vary by months. What we can say for sure is that no attack is documented in the weeks right after the jazz night. That's real and worth noting, but that's a much more modest claim than the legend. Claim 5, the one we set aside earlier, that the chalk message proves one killer working a campaign stretching back to 1912. Let's actually put the two cases side by side instead of just asserting the connection. Some things line up. Both attacks targeted Italian grocer couples. Both happened at night. Both while the victims were in bed. That's a real meaningful overlap, not nothing. But one category we haven't checked yet is the weapon, and that's where this gets more complicated. The 1918 attacks are consistently bladed or blunt force, razor, axe, or hatchet. The 1912 Ciambra attack, from what we can tell, involved a gunshot. That's a real difference in method. It doesn't completely rule out a connection. Methods can change over 6 years, or these could be separate cases that later got linked by the chalk message and the similar victim profile. Both possibilities are still on the table. So we've now gone through the main claims. Some of them hold up reasonably well. Others have real gaps or inconsistencies. The picture that comes out is more complicated than the legend usually tells it, and that's worth sitting with. Legends can be oral records, and they lead to an interesting question. What if real events are hiding underneath the legend? One early example of this sits in September 1910 in the 7th Ward. Concetta and Joseph Rossetto were asleep in their home when a man climbed in through an unlatched kitchen window. He used a meat axe he found right there in their kitchen. Both of them survived. $23 sat untouched just a few feet away. This is the earliest known case where the attacker deliberately left the money behind. Summer 1911, same neighborhood. 16-year-old Mary Davy and her husband Joseph had just opened a shop in St. Roch. Joseph was killed. Mary survived, and she told police something that would matter much later. Her attacker spoke plain English with no accent at all. That detail went into the record and mostly stayed buried for the next 100 years. Then, in May 1912, across the river in Gretna, Tony and Joanna Ciambra were shot in their own grocery. Joanna didn't survive. 2 real attacks, both unsolved, both filed away. After that, the record goes quiet for 6 years before anything like this pattern shows up again. Then, on May 23, 1918, 6 years after the Ciambra attack, the record picks back up. Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were asleep above their grocery when someone came in. They used a razor that belonged to Joseph's brother Andrew and an axe that was already in the house. Joseph died within minutes. Catherine didn't survive the night. And on the pavement, right outside, someone had written 4 words in chalk. The same message the legend still remembers, naming Joanna Ciambra by her married name. Police questioned Joseph's brother Andrew right away. It was his razor, and he'd been out drinking the night before. He couldn't fully account for where he'd been. There was nothing physical tying him to the attack, beyond the fact that he owned the razor. After hours of questioning, they let him go. He was the first person they wrongly suspected in this case. He wouldn't be the last. 1 month later, in June 1918, Louis Bessemer and his companion Harriet Lowe were found unconscious in the back of his grocery. They'd been struck with his own hatchet. A grocery employee, Louis Obacon, was arrested over a scheduling discrepancy, nothing else, and released the same day. Bessemer himself was arrested twice, once because police found letters in his house they couldn't read and assumed they were spy correspondence. A jury acquitted him in 10 minutes. August 1918, Anna Schneider, 8 months pregnant, was attacked in her own bed. She survived. Her daughter was born 2 days later. 5 days after that, Joseph Romano was attacked in his bedroom. His nieces saw a man fleeing, heavy-set and wearing a dark suit. Romano died 2 days later. Police arrested an ex-convict named James Gleason nearby, but he had no connection to the case and was released within days. By the end of that summer, the city was exactly as frightened as the legend remembers. Then, on the record, 7 months of nothing. March 10, 1919, Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia and their 2-year-old daughter Mary were asleep above their grocery in Gretna. Charles and Rosie were both struck and survived. Mary did not. She was 2 years old. Their neighbor, E. Orlando Giordano, heard the attack and ran across the street before anyone had even called for help. E. Orlando got towels and tried to help before anyone else arrived. His 17-year-old son Frank ran to call for an ambulance. On the record, that was the last thing either of them did as free men for the next year and 8 months. Police asked Rosie who had done this before she'd even been told her daughter was dead. When she finally named someone, it was E. Orlando and Frank, the men who had run to help her. Her own husband told police in front of witnesses that she was wrong, that he'd seen a stranger, not their neighbors. The jury believed her anyway. They deliberated for 45 minutes. 9 months into Frank Giordano's death sentence, Rosie walked into the newspaper office and signed a new statement. She said she'd never actually seen who attacked her family. She'd been pressured into naming the Giordanos. On the record, that retraction is what finally moved the case. Not new evidence, not a confession, just a mother taking back the only thing she'd ever told them. In December 1920, both Orlando and Frank were released. Frank had spent 9 months under a death sentence for running toward a house to help. 3 days after Mary Cortimiglia's death, while Orlando and Frank sat in jail awaiting trial, a letter arrived at the Times-Picayune, postmarked from hell. On the record, the letter threatened a specific night and promised to spare any home playing jazz music. The city had 5 days to decide whether to believe it. On the night itself, this city did exactly what the legend says it did. And exactly like the legend says, nobody was killed that night. October 1919, Mike Pepitone, a grocer, was asleep above his store with his wife Esther and their 6 children. He was killed the same way as every name before it. One more attack, and then the record of these killings goes quiet. His widow Esther eventually moved to Los Angeles. Years later, she shot a man named Joseph Mumphrey on her own doorstep, certain to the end that he was the one responsible. So we've got 9 real cases on the books, all documented, and the legend's already carrying the same pieces: the panel, the axe and razor, the chalk message, the letter, that jazz night. Let's trace which real event could have given the legend which detail, and how those threads might have woven together. We'll start with the panel. Rossetto, Maggio, Bessemer, Romano, Cortimiglia, every one of these 5 cases has the same detail. They all cut that panel, and that's exactly what the legend says he always did. So when the story claims he always cut the same panel, it's describing something the real cases already show happening 5 separate times. This detail lines up with the record. One piece that checks out against what actually happened. Let's see if the rest hold up the same way. Here's where it gets specific. The chalk message names a woman, and that name isn't vague. It points straight to the Chiambre case from 1912, 6 years earlier. Whoever wrote that message in 1918 knew an unsolved case well enough to use the victim's name. That could be the same person still active 6 years later, or someone who'd heard about the 1912 case and wanted it remembered. Either way, this detail in the legend matches something that was already on the record 6 years before the message was written. It didn't have to be created for the story. One of the claims that stands out is the letter. 3 days after the worst attack, it arrives threatening a night 5 days later. We checked the timeline ourselves. 8 days total, start to finish, and it lines up exactly. The jazz night matches the record too. The city really did light up its windows instead of locking its doors, and nobody was killed that night. So 3 of the 5 claims check out against what actually happened. Here's where it gets more complicated, the part most retellings skip over completely. The letter that created the Jazz Night legend, the most famous document in this entire case, has never been examined as physical evidence. No fingerprints, no handwriting analysis, not back in 1919, and not since. We know exactly what got printed in the papers. We just don't know who actually wrote the letter, or whether anyone's ever tried to find out. Which means the single most famous thing in this whole story might also be the part we understand the least. So here's where we land. The panel holds up. The chalk message is real but limited. The letter's authorship is in doubt. The jazz night happened. Nobody died that night. The 1912 link stays open. The weakest claims build the legend's biggest reputation, the demon's voice and the decade-long campaign. The best documented parts are the quietest. The parts people remember most are the ones we trust least. 9 true events, 100 years of retelling. They got pressed into one story small enough to carry. Here's the gap the legend fills. Most versions end after the letter and jazz night. The record shows one more attack, then silence. Later tellings gave it a dramatic ending. The killer walked into the wrong house. The record has no such confrontation. The story simply refuses to stay quiet. It's possible the true events could have drawn closer with each telling. Separate attacks can slowly gather until they start to read as one connected story. We've seen this kind of shift before. Real events shared long enough can gradually come together into one story. That's where it gets interesting. After going through the record and seeing how these events could have slowly come together, it leaves us with the question about what actually happened. Tell me in the comments what you believe. Is the legend true and it was one man operating for 9 years? Or do you believe it was multiple killers and the story just got retold and combined over time into one? Was the letter real? Was it a hoax? Not every killer needs a city. Sometimes all it takes is a mountain, a blizzard, and a woman with one impossible choice. She has no name in the record. the man who killed her does. That's a case worth looking into, and the gap between a legend and the record might be even harder to close. Watch it next.